All right, so welcome back for chapter 2 of economics. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see what we're talking about today. So the focus of chapter 2 is all about economic models. And so we're going to look at some different examples of those models and then get into kind of the main one that we'll spend the most time on here. So chapter 2 starts on page 22. Well, let's dive on in. So couple questions to think about as we get started. Okay. Did you play with any models when you were a kid, okay, when you were younger? Sometimes people build models of different things like cars or airplanes or trains is kind of a big one, especially at Christmas time. You see lots of people with their little model railroads set up. So models serve a purpose, right? People make them in order to maybe learn a little bit more about the different parts that actually make them up. All right, so when it comes to models, they're basically a simplification of the real actual thing, and they're used for two major purposes, one for instruction and the other for assistance in predicting future events. And so economists really focus on that predicting future events part. So there's 4 different models that your book talks about. One is a tabular model. Another is a line graph, which you're super familiar with. Then we have the production possibilities curve, otherwise known as the PPC. And then the last one that we'll spend the most amount of time on is the circular flow model. So when it comes to our first type here, we have just a basic kind of table, a tabular model or a schedule, some people call it. It's probably the most popular method of explaining relationships between two different pairs of variables. So in this figure here, we have on one side the price per can of Coastal Cola, it looks like, and then on the other side we have the quantity sold. So a tabular model helps to show the relationship between those two different variables and provide information that really can be seen at a glance. Okay? A line graph, on the other hand, provides a little bit more detail. So you can see on one axis we have the price, right? And on the other, we have how many are sold, and it looks like in quantities of basically a million from what I can see there. Okay. So again, a line graph can tell us approximately how many cans will be sold at any given price that falls along there between 50 cents and $2. So again, just a different way to look at the information. All right. One that you might not be as familiar with is called the production possibilities curve, or the PPC. Basically, this type of model allows economists to see the maximum amounts of 2 different commodities that a business could make at the same time. So let's say that we own a factory, and our factory can make cars and it can make wooden chairs. Okay, so this model over here shows us the maximum amount that we can make at the same time. Okay, so a point that falls below that curve, okay, is letting us know that we're not producing at our most efficient amount. Okay, a point that falls outside or above that curve, you can see the red dot with the G next to it. That is something that would be impossible for our factory to produce with the quantities and the equipment and the machines that we have. So basically, this production possibilities curve lets people know what the maximum feasible amount is that can be produced when those items are competing for that business's resources. So it really basically is just kind of an efficiency curve, letting businesses know that they're producing the maximum amount that they can. All right, our last type of model is called the circular flow model. Your book goes into a lot of detail starting on page 28 about this. And basically it's just a visual explanation of how many nations' economies function. Okay, that's just the basics of it. Okay, so it shows the different groups or different entities that are involved with businesses and households. Business firms create billions of dollars in goods and services, and households are the principal purchasers of those goods and services. So if you were to add up all those goods and services, you would have a figure that economists refer to as the gross domestic product, or GDP. And we'll talk about that in a later chapter. Okay. So if you were to add up the total of all that the households spend on these goods and services, you would have what economists call consumption expenditures. So let's look at business firms and households, okay, and start there. So on one side, we have our businesses represented by the little factories, and then we have our households represented by the little house there, okay? And we were just talking about that gross domestic product or the gross national product, and we'll talk about the difference between those two in a later chapter. So households consume things. They buy things from businesses, okay? And businesses have factors of production, things that they need to produce those goods and services. So things like land and labor, the financial capital that they need, the money for entrepreneurship. So land is pretty basic, okay? Whether it's animal or vegetable or mineral resource, right? Labor oftentimes is the human effort that goes into making things. The capital would be that financial backing. Okay, and entrepreneurship directs, organizes, and plans the process of making those things. Okay, we also have factor payments. Okay, so what do businesses have to pay out? Well, they have to pay out those factor payments, those factor costs, things like rent, okay, for the use of maybe the property, wages for the people that are producing those goods and services. It might be a yearly salary or an hourly wage, a bonus, okay. Interest. So maybe they have borrowed money to get their business going, and so there's interest on that. And then profits. So profit is the difference between the revenues received from the sale of a product and the cost of the land, the labor, and the capital that went into all of that. So those would be factor payments. And your book talks about these factor payments or factor costs on pages 31 and 32. Right, and then we add in the government, right? And the government is part of this economy. So they are buying things from businesses, as you can see, those purchases. So maybe they're buying tanks or airplanes, and those businesses are then paying taxes back to the government, right? And households have to pay taxes to the government, and sometimes the government then has payments that go to households. If you paid too much in your taxes or you're receiving Social Security or some other kind of benefit, money is going back to you. Okay. Then things get a little more complicated when you throw in financial markets. Okay. That is the place where households can save money. They can borrow money. You see the word there, dis savings. So economists apply the term dis saving anytime a household withdraws money from an account or borrows money. So it's kind of a weird word, but basically we could say withdrawals or loans. Okay? And then you can see on the business side of our circular flow model, the businesses are taking loans from these financial markets, or the banks is another fancy word there, and then they have to repay those. So lastly, let's add in one final entity that your book doesn't really talk about. If you look at the model on page 35 here, you will notice that the Federal Reserve does not show up in your book. But I do want you to understand who is creating the money and who is taking the money out of this whole model. So the Federal Reserve prints the money, right, and they send it to those financial markets or those banks, and the banks circulate that. And when that money gets old and nasty and gross or worn out, then it gets withdrawn through the banks and sent to the Federal Reserve to basically destroy. So those are the components in the circular flow model. And you have a couple questions today to answer related to that. So feel free to use these slides to help for your book. All right. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.